How many times in the last 30 years have there been debates in Australian politics about the need for innovation and diversification of the economy? It's constant. How much of it's happened? Not much. Home ownership, again, is so important, not just to the economy, but to our polity, if you like. When you're a Territorian and you've been experiencing something sort of this creeping crime, and it's possible to have Stockholm Syndrome because you're living it every day, you don't feel like it's as bad as it might otherwise seem.
All right, Ben Carter, thanks for joining us on the Next Gen North podcast.
No worries, great to be here.
So I understand, well, just to get it on record, you've recently resigned as the CE of the Master Builders NT.
Absolutely.
Are you onto greener pastures, or what's brought that about?
Well, it's great to be here to start off with. It's great to have a bit of a break from packing up all my belongings and putting them on a truck, which I've just done. So it's great to be here. Look, I've spent the last 2 years or nearly 2 years in Darwin. I've given it what I think is a fair shake. I've just found that it's not for me. I found it a bit, to be honest, a bit isolating. And in the end, if you're not into fishing or other things in Darwin, I think you can find that to be the case. But having said that, I'd never talk Darwin down. I think it's got lots and lots and lots of potential. I think, though, that it needs to take some really serious steps to realise that potential, though.
Yep. So to help our sort of audience understand where you come from a little bit, where are you from originally and what brought you to Darwin?
Sure. So without giving you my entire life story, I was born in Melbourne. My father's a Uniting Church minister, so we spent a bit of time as kids travelling around regional Victoria. And then I went to uni in Melbourne, obviously. And after about working in politics for a few years, and participating in that, and then finding my way up to Canberra, where I travelled for a job. So there wasn't a really compelling lifestyle reason to go to Canberra.
Right.
Although you have to say Canberra in some ways is a good example to Darwin in terms of potential.
Okay.
Because when I arrived most people 20 years ago whose experience of Canberra was pretty dreadful, but it's really boosted itself up a bit in terms of its livability. So I think that's an interesting comparison. And then I was with Master Builders Australia, which is not the peak body because Master Builders is a federation, so it's the constituent parts of its state and territory divisions.
Yep.
And Master Builders Australia is the sort of the national lobbying body. So that was my role there was National Director of Media and Communication and Partnerships. And so in that capacity, I travelled around.
Yep.
To different Master Builders Associations, coming up to Darwin a few times.
Yep.
Met the guys up here, have a high regard for them. My predecessor, he's my predecessor. He in the role, he left, retired. Well, he hasn't really retired, but he'd like to say that.
Yeah.
And then I came up.
Sure.
So that was basically the background. And obviously, I liked it in the times that I'd come up. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't have come.
Yep.
But I guess, unfortunately for me, I found that it probably isn't. Well, it definitely isn't the place that I want to be. I just hasn't worked out in it from a lifestyle perspective.
Sure,
I guess.
sure. Well, it sounds like you've got a few strings to your bow there, Ben. But what? Just to sort of stick with the Canberra theme for a second and the livability. What did Canberra do 20 years ago that might have improved the place? I understand there's a lot of public servants there, and maybe not as much private industry as your Sydneys and Melbournes and those sorts of places. What have they done to make the place a better place to live?
Well, you touch on a good point, which we can talk about a bit later. But that's a really good comparison to Darwin too. Is that it's Darwin and both Canberra both have.
I might just get you to move your mic down a touch, just down a touch. Yep, just to capture. Yep, try that.
So I was just saying that there's a very high proportion of public servants in both Canberra and Darwin, and that obviously it's not a bad thing. But what it can do is if you don't have high levels of private investment, it can mean that things are a bit one-dimensional.
Sure.
And you don't get the dynamism that you get when you have more diverse, when you have both private sector and public sector investment and employees. I think what happened in Canberra was that they got a bigger population. They started to get a bigger population. That made things a bit more different for them. They could create a bit more dynamism.
Was that a concerted effort to bring people in?
I don't think so. I think it just happened because Canberra is the place where everything happens to be. It's also very livable. It's not cheap to live there, but it's very safe.
Right.
Very, very safe. You could basically, because there's lots of diplomats and things like that, they're living there. There's lots of security, not ostentatious security, but there's enough.
Just to have a presence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. So you'd have to be. I think you had to struggle pretty hard in Canberra to find somewhere that you didn't want, that you felt unsafe.
Is that right?
So it's there are obviously parts of it that are less safe, but as a place, it's pretty secure, very safe, and it's not like Sydney or Melbourne, obviously, but there are attractive parts about that, just like there are for that with Darwin. But they've invested in, like their shopping malls. They've invested in sprucing them up.
Yep.
They've got the David Jones, the Myers, and those places. So they've got enough people there, and they've invested enough.
Yep.
To get those, and that's important. They've got. I know that for whatever reason, Dan Murphy's is a controversy here.
Yep.
I'm not really au fait about what that's about. But, it's those sort of things where you can go and have that sort of shopping experience and livability. You've got art galleries in Canberra, obviously. You're about to have 2 more here, which is a great thing.
Yep.
And they've also invested in their regional tourism experience. So You've got what they call a Canberra wine region, which is actually regional New South Wales wine region, but just outside of Canberra. But just outside of Canberra, there's like regional towns, little towns that have got tourism experiences and little wine regions and little, that sort of foodie culture that they've developed.
So it's just more amenity.
Yeah, and also they package it together and they consciously develop it, I guess.
Right.
So it's just like Victoria did way back in the 90s when all the regional towns in Victoria lost their heavily subsidised factories for whatever industry. Those all closed. There was a period of depression, and then there was Victorian tourism really rebounded and solved that problem for most of those regional towns now.
Yep.
That was a really conscientious effort to develop the regional identity, so those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah.
So the transition then from the eastern sort of seaboard, I guess you could call it, to the top end. What brought you here? Was it the job at Master Builders?
It was the job at Master Builders. Yeah.
Yep.
And look, as I said, who doesn't? I'd been here before, quite a few times, usually in the depths of winter down south.
Yeah.
And the dry season in Darwin is stunning.
Yep.
Anyone here now just
loving it.
And I have lots of mates who down south who always say, why do we have to have meetings in Master Builders, mates? Why do we have to have meetings in Canberra or in Adelaide this time of year when Darwin's just so beautiful? You can't minimise that as a thing. But I did come for the job. Yeah.
Yep. So can you tell us a little bit about what Master Builders is, what it does? What's its remit?
Sure.
What's function? Does it have a membership, that sort of thing?
So Master Builders is a national movement comprised of Master Builders associations in every state and territory, and then there's a Master Builders Australia, which, as I said, is sort of the national lobbying organisation that was created by those state and territory associations.
Yep.
So what they do is what Master Builders does is represent the building and construction industry, and it's one of those things. It's without singing, it's without being biased. It's the only association in our industry that represents all 3 sectors. So it represents the commercial construction, which is office buildings and school building and apartment building.
Sure.
And then there's residential building, which obviously has an overlap with apartments. But when they talk about residential, they really mean detached houses,
right?
Which is you guys with a ute and a dog, building. Spec homes and display homes and homes to contract homes to water.
Sort of, yep.
Yep. And then civil, which is obviously your roads and your bridges and your a lot of the work on defence bases and stuff like that. So there are different associations in the industry that represent particular one sector.
Yep.
But Master Builders represents all 3, and that's really its competitive advantage, if you like.
Right.
So it has members. which are member businesses. So, residential builders, commercial builders, and civil construction businesses all join master builders.
Yep.
And obviously the memberships are pretty big depending on which state, comparatively speaking. So, in New South Wales, for instance, they've got over 9,000 members, I think, now. And in the Territory, it's around 250 to 300.
Yep.
So it's...
Is that a healthy number, or is there work to be done there?
Oh, it's pretty healthy.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, look...
Proportionally?
Yeah, proportionally. Yep. And also, look, there's a big opportunity, though, because with the defence investment that's coming up to Northern Australia and Darwin in particular, it's $6.2 billion over the next 5 or 6 years.
Yep.
And then unapproved amounts, when I say unapproved, I mean by, the federal government's flagged that there will be, between 14 and 18 billion spent to the next decade to 2030.
Wow.
But having said that, that's, 6 of that is already happening, but the rest of it is yet to be, documented.
Sure.
It's that classic utopia moment where, until it's real, it's not real. But but at least it's flagged. So we should have some confidence that it is coming.
Yeah, and something that you can hold the government to, hopefully.
Absolutely. And also the US government loves Northern Australia and Darwin because it has such big open spaces. Anyone has to be my old office used to be overlooking the RAF base from the Stuart Highway, and you'd see all the fighter jets and the massive cargo planes, RAF and US cargo planes coming and offloading, and, the Ospreys every night. So you can see that activity. It's a lot of US military activity for the Marines. That's only going to increase. And then there's real prospect of Japanese self-defense force involvement in the next couple of years, and probably the Indians as well,
right?
The Indian government. So there's some real potential here from the defence perspective. And the US will, of that $6.2 billion I mentioned in the next 5 years or 6 years, about $2 billion of that is US government money, so US DoD, Department of Defence money, and that's probably being conservative. So there is real action on that front. So there's potential there. Yeah.
Great. So you mentioned obviously the involvement from all those governments, both domestically and foreign. How's the relationship with the Territory government between master builders and the Territory?
You mean
the Northern Territory government
and master builders?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been good. I think this current government's done some good things. It's been committed to defence. It's invested in Defence NT, which is a really important part of the NT's defence advocacy. It needs to, whichever government's in power, whoever is in government after the 24th of August, I would be hoping that they would invest more in Defence NT.
Right.
One of the things we have to realise in the Territory, I think we get a bit colloquial in the sense that we think, why would we spend money on sending people overseas, sending government ministers overseas to the US to talk to the defence people over there, or to Japan? We've got to realise that every other state and territory, with the exception of the ACT obviously, but every other state has trade commissioners permanently based in places like New York, permanently based in places like San Francisco and other jurisdictions in Japan. They're permanently there. They spend millions of dollars every year in South Australia and Queensland and Victoria and New South Wales, obviously, and WA, spend millions of dollars each year hosting or housing people, their trade representatives and their, people talking about defence in those places. So they have a real presence over there. And yet Territorians get a bit shitty sometimes when they hear they spend $60,000.
Yeah.
Territorians have really got to get an appreciation if they really want this place to kick off. There needs to be some investment in that stuff, in actually, in telling the story, and making the links, because it isn't going to happen by itself. I think a lot of my impression is I think Territorians sometimes feel like it's just going to happen by itself. It'll just happen. Someone will come and build a big INPEX, or someone will bring some Marines, but it doesn't happen by itself. And I mean, if you're talking about INPEX, I mean, one day someone's going to tell the untold story of how they stole INPEX from WA.
Yeah. Well, we had Claire Martin on here.
Well, there you go. She was, that's right. And she'll tell you it doesn't happen by itself.
Yeah.
So I mean, I was really fortunate to go to the US last year with our infrastructure commissioner, major progress commissioner up here, and a member of the Northern Territory's National Security Advisory Committee.
Yep.
And it really was really opened my eyes to what can be to the Americans. Real respect and I'm not going to say love, but love from a potential perspective in Northern Australia and in Darwin.
Yep.
So bases like Delamere and training facilities like the Rangers, those things really are attractive to the Americans. But there's Townsville, there's other places in Northern Australia and around Australia who want to not steal, but to take the opportunity and the Northern Territory government really needs to, whichever one's in power, it's not a criticism of any particular party, it's just a need to be constantly making sure that the Territory is competitive and is perceived as competitive and is telling a positive story in those places.
Yep. Well, really, the Territory should be the beachhead, shouldn't it, to Asia to the north, really, considering the geopolitical landscape of our neighbours to the north, what's going on in the South China Sea, that sort of thing. So is that
absolutely
going to be more critical, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And so the Defence Strategic Review, which Defence Minister Richard Marles released last year, was really a watershed in that what it did was it actually established the national security credentials of Northern Australia. So what it actually said was put it on paper and said that basically, Darwin and the Territory and Northern Australia, the top end, but across Northern Australia, WA and Northern Queensland, really enshrined its importance, as you say, in the geostrategic context, geopolitical context, and talked about the need to strengthen the resilience of northern bases and training facilities as much as anything else, so the Americans can come and the Australian Defence Force can also use it as a launch pad to project power. It's not like you're making yourself a target for an invasion. It's not like it's, when you were 12 years old and you were playing toy soldiers, or you're in the 1800s and you're looking at, British redcoats coming over the horizon. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is going to be all sorts of, armaments and we have to prevent
drones and
God knows what else. And we have to prevent. Also, we have to project power. So we have to be able to do island hopping through the region to get to what's the word? Be a deterrent and have the kit that's stored here and have the Marines able to use this as a hub. Have the amphibious and littoral ships here that we can project out into the region to do that. So, and hopefully when we do get the AUKUS submarines eventually, hopefully Darwin can play a role in some way in that in basing or repairing or refreshing and sustaining, I think is the right word for that. So just to touch on that, so the DSR, as they call it, was really important because Darwin and the North obviously had its strategically important moments previously, but that's always been a bit reactive. So obviously when World War II was here, everyone had to all of a sudden go, oh my God, we need to get some people up there, we need to build a railway, we need to do all these things. So hopefully what the DSR has done is really, and signalled also to our key allies, to the Americans and the Japanese and the Singaporeans, for instance, and all of those people and the Indians, that we are, and also other people in the region like the Filipinos, that we're here, that we understand the strategic challenges, and the DSR has made the North really important. So that's the power of that document. But what obviously needs to flow is the follow through. And what AUKUS does, which is not about the North per se, but it can be. But what AUKUS is about is obviously nuclear submarines. But it's also about what it's also really about, apart from that, is about alliance politics. What it does is it says that the Americans are not going to fight wars by themselves. And we had this from when we had visited the Pentagon last year. We had that reinforced to us by Marine generals and other people in the Pentagon that the Americans aren't going to fight wars by themselves. They need to fight them with allies, and therefore they have to have really strong, in-depth relationships with and local relationships with their allies. So that's really important that happens. And so there's potential here for that to really be the hub
Yep.
of that.
Yeah.
So it's really important.
Well, I'd like to come back to defence if we
Sure.
can a bit later on, considering you guys have you have a defence report, don't you?
Yeah, about just the construction issues. Yeah.
So we'd like to get into some of those.
Nice.
Just in the interim, I just wanted to also touch on a forecast that the master builders did regarding residential build, and I think it was 270 for 23-24 financial year homes to be constructed.
Yep. New homes
down 55% on previous year, and well off the mark from the 11,000 needed over the next 5 years, which is I think a Northern Territory government target. How do we reconcile those numbers? What does that mean for the territory?
Well, to be entirely fair, the 11,000 is a Housing Australia Future Fund. I think it is. They call it the HAF target.
Right.
So there's a national target and there's a state and territory target for each jurisdiction, and just about everybody is way behind. so the territory's not in no way alone in that regard versus that target. So just to put the context into that.
Yep.
Although it is by far the furthest behind, and that's obviously reflective of the fact that it's on track to be the worst ever year in the last financial year, so 23-24, since history or records began.
Sure.
And I think I'm not sure whether, so 270 was the forecast, and I think it was March this year. I'm not sure what it's looking like now, but it's
we are nearing the end of that forecasted period, aren't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I think some of that will be affected by we can touch on this in a minute, by the grants.
Yep. Because
activity will slow and then in anticipation of the grants coming on. But it's diabolical. It is the absolute worst year since records began in Darwin. It is just terrible. And what that does is housing investment, so investment in new homes, not government-funded housing, investment in private sector investment, is a really key indicator of the performance of an economy. So what it shows is that people don't have confidence to invest privately in Darwin.
Yep.
To build a home, people down south don't have confidence or want to come to Darwin to do that, to start a family, but to start a house or to build a house and
build a life.
Build a life, exactly. Build a life.
Yep.
The Darwin Major Business Group recently did a major report called Over the Horizon Opportunities, which showed that Darwin Airport basically is a departure lounge for people from Darwin, but also people who come recently and then leave. So you've got migrants who come here to take the opportunity up, and then they come here and they find they can't sustain it, they don't want to be here, and then they get lured to northern Queensland or to Perth because those jurisdictions, are really aggressive about luring people. They give them a whole lot of benefits and a whole lot of opportunities, and that's why I think the housing grants, which we can talk about in a minute again, are really important. But this forecast is just diabolical. It's just reflective of a real problem, and it just shows that there's a lack of confidence from the private sector in the Darwin Territory economy.
Yep.
Now the government will say, well, that's not fair because there is private sector investment, and there is. So the Tamboran deal that's been done is a really good thing that the Territory government did.
Yep.
Has done, and they should deserve credit for that. And they are on the lookout for things. But having said that, to say that there's not a massive problem when you can't build more than 270 homes in a year is just crazy. So that's really, really terrible.
Right.
So if we'd like to move on to what's happened since, or
well, I was going to just ask, what's holding us back then? Is it costs of labour? Is it costs of materials? Is it an over-regulated building, construction sector? What, in your mind, is the problem, and maybe what are the potential antidotes?
Sure. So we can go into this. So housing around Australia is in shortage supply at the moment, and there are, regardless of which jurisdiction you're in terms of housing in Australia, there are some really common issues that need to be tackled, and these are largely structural issues. So Master Builders Australia did some work about 5 years ago, which was commissioned from economic modelers and using Treasury data and RBR Reserve Bank data, which showed that over time, adjusted for inflation, the cost of construction really hasn't got adjusted for inflation. It's a key point, but the cost of construction hasn't gone up that much.
Okay.
But the cost of land and has gone up a fair bit.
Right.
And that's because there's all sorts of headwork. People now, if you think about it, 20 years ago, probably further, people didn't need to have, for platinum plated, roads and internets and, all of that sort of stuff that we have now that really are, no one will go there until it's all done. So there's that element of it. Then there's also issues of approval. Now in the Territory, because it's all theoretically Crown land, there shouldn't be as much of a problem, but there are still places where local government are issues in terms of approvals for building.
Right.
So there's that. In the Territory, there's been problems with land previously, the supply of land, lack of what they call titled lots. So what happens is the government can release, in inverted commas, land that is badged for residential construction or residential building or for housing. But until they're what's called titled, until all the headwork's is done and they're ready to, and basically until someone like you or anyone can drive down the road into one of these places and actually buy a block of land, until that happens, it's not really released.
Yep.
Right? It is released. It will happen, but it's not real today until it's ready until you can buy it. Until you can buy a block of land and you know that you've got a road that goes in there and goes out. You've got all your headworks, all your sewer and electricity and power and all those things. Until you know that's there, you can't buy it. And until you can't buy it, it's not real.
Yep.
So the Territory has had historically, or actually not historically, very recently, a problem with the supply of those sort of blocks of land.
So is that a government problem? That could be
has been a government problem and could continue to be if they fall back. But they've had they commissioned a report called Bringing Land to Market, which made a whole lot of recommendations about how to increase supply. To tackle those structural issues, structural barriers. And that's been, the government will tell you it's been a wild success.
How's the industry?
The industry would say it's been since the government has committed to the recommendations and they have delivered most of them.
Right.
And we would say that at the moment there's been an improvement in the amount of title land that can be sold. Okay. But it could very easily fall back the other way.
Yep.
Now, one of the things we should say about the housing market is that the housing market doesn't sort of turn off and turn on overnight. Master builders before my time, prior to my arrival, had been talking to government and others about the fact that there was a shortage of private sector housing, and that wasn't universally embraced. And so what happens now is the forecast we face now is really a legacy of those of a sort of it takes time to turn off and turn on the housing market. Mm-hmm. So to touch on the supply issues, we've got those. The point I was making was that nationally we have those issues. In the Territory, we've been dealing with them thanks to the Bringing Land to Market report and the government's commitment to implement most of those recommendations. So that has improved things. And so that's part of the equation. But what we also face now in the Territory, and what's probably led to, probably contributed most recently to this issue to the most recent forecast for the last financial year or the end of this financial year, is a demand issue. So we've been probably just starting to get on top of the supply issue,
right?
But we've been now faced with a demand issue, and this forecast very much reflects things like crime, levels of crime, and antisocial behaviour, and livability issues, which are perceived and actually are pretty terrible. So, I think that when you're a Territorian and you've been experiencing this creeping increase in levels of crime and antisocial behaviour, it's possible to have Stockholm syndrome, and you because you're living it every day, you don't quite feel like it's as bad as it might otherwise seem. But again, the Darwin Major Business Group's report showed that even in comparison to Northern Queensland, which is not without its own problems, it's something like 8 times more likely, to be a victim of either property crime against property or against people in Darwin. And that's, I'm not saying that we're in sort of in the middle of, a failed African state
Yep.
or South American, drug cartel land,
Yep.
but it's pretty terrible.
Yeah.
And you've got to acknowledge that as a problem. If you were being honest with yourself and trying to think whether you would, if you were down south, for instance,
Yep.
with just got married with a young family and you were, or with a partner and, you were contemplating whether you'd come up to take one of the great opportunities, the great job opportunities up here, and there are many job opportunities up here, but would you come up and bring your partner and young child up here?
Yep.
It's a real question you have to ask yourself, and I think that what we're seeing is that the answer is no.
So is that where the gap in demand is now created? So we had that. You said that there was a supply issue that we're sort of starting to.
There's a demand
come to
issue,
terms with
yeah.
it, but the demand was was that from interstate?
That's partly,
Was
yes.
That, was that interstate?
No, it's all. No, what it is there's no new, but it's not about demand from. It doesn't track where the demand's from. It just finds that there's no demand, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So people in the territory aren't building new homes either.
Yep.
Right. But given the population, we need to get the Territorians to start building new homes. We also need to get people from up south, down south, and also the people who are here, who are coming from other places in the world, getting them to stay. So we talk a lot about increasing population in Darwin and Territory, which we desperately need to do, because that's where economic growth in the end comes from. And there are no capacity issues up here as there are in Sydney or Melbourne. But one of the most effective things you can do to keep somebody is to get them into a home ownership, get them into a mortgage.
Yep.
They'll be here, even if it's not forever, they'll be here for at least 10 years. And then by that stage, they will have put down roots and makes it much harder. Your kids have friends and going to school, it makes it harder to them to leave.
Yep.
And that's one of the things we need to do. So that's why we need to have more housing, and we need to tackle the issue of demand, and we need to tackle the issue of perception, which feeds into that. What are the factors in demand? Now, obviously, interest rates.
Yep. Cost of living.
Factor two. Cost of living is a factor two. Let's not pretend that they're not factors.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they've always been factors.
Yep.
So people have always had to save for a home loan deposit. People have always had to build a house. It's always been expensive, relatively speaking. It's always going to be the most expensive thing you ever do, invest in as a person or as a family. So it's always been an issue. And there's always been, let's not forget there's been times of higher interest rates, much higher interest rates than this. So while that's an issue, it shouldn't be viewed as being the major barrier.
Yep.
And so, but having said that, the issue of housing affordability is probably not the right issue to talk about. It's not about the price of houses, really.
Right.
Because that's a long-term issue that you need to address through supply by tackling those structural issues.
Sure.
The major problem in the immediate term is always the deposit gap.
Okay.
Which means that people find it hard to save up 120 grand.
Yep.
And they find it particularly hard when cost of living pressures are higher and interest rates are higher. Excuse me. And so the deposit gaps is a key issue, and probably is the major issue in terms of the demand for housing in recent times.
Yeah. So in terms of bridging that deposit gap divide, I should say, is that where something like the CLP's now offered 50 grand for essentially anyone in Australia to come and build a house in the Territory? Labor's offered 60, but I think it's mostly directed at Territorians. Does that come into play in bridging that sort of divide, or does that not equate in this scenario?
No, it absolutely does. It is a game changer, and what's really amazing for the industry and for the Territory now is that we have both major parties who are committed to these grants.
Yep.
So what we now this will boost confidence enormously, and both parties should be applauded for responding, albeit in slightly different ways, and you can argue less effective ways in some ways, but both of them have responded and very substantially so. This will send really good signals to people down south. So you'll get people in the community, particularly in government or in community housing circles, will say that these are terrible idea to do this.
Yep.
But it's not about, the key issue is to remember, it's just not an affordability measure. This is an economic measure. So it's no coincidence that housing grants to build new homes, which is what we're talking about.
Yep.
So CLP, $50,000 for first home buyers, $30,000 for owner occupiers from anywhere in Australia and overseas, obviously if you're an Australian resident. And in the government's case, Territory Labor's case, it's $60,000 for first home buyers. And I think they're mainly talking, as you say, they're saying their point of difference is I think that it's about Territorians mostly.
Yep.
But these are game changers because what they'll do is that it says to people down south and other places that there's an opportunity here.
Yep.
And what it does is it helps redress issues of negative perception and negative sentiment in the territory. So again, we're talking about those young families or even people who are much older, never owned a home, and also have owned a home in the CLP's case. What that means is you can come to the territory and you can, even if you factor in some of the antisocial behaviour and the crime, you can get over that mentally because you're going to have this amazing opportunity. These are going to be the biggest grants in Australia. I think WA's got 30K,
yep.
30 grand, but no one else comes near 50 and 60. And it is going to be significant. It'll turn it on in terms of demand, and you'll get criticism from people who say this will just bring forward demand.
I was going to ask that. Is there those unintended consequences? The future seller of a home says, "Oh, okay, there's now $50,000 or $60,000 more in the system. I can just take my $500,000 home that I'm selling for that much and add another 50 or 60 grand to it." Is that our own or vendors, are they going to just be pricing those increases straight in, or how does that all sort of work?
So there's criticisms of these grants previously that. Oh, and currently too, that's what happens.
Yeah.
So the standard criticism of these grants is, it'll just add 50 grand to the cost of a home.
Sure.
That's, to be really honest, pretty much bullshit.
Does that not come out in the data?
No, so people will show, there'll be data that shows from like the think tanks like the Grattan Institute and stuff, people are always quoting them, that it does increase the value of the price of a house. And it does, right?
Yep.
But there's no evidence to say that it increases it by dollar for dollar, right? So if I give you $100,000, it doesn't mean that the price of the house you buy is going up by $100,000,
Yep.
right? But of course, if you put a subsidy into the market, there will be people who take that subsidy, and so there will be people who there will be the price of a house will go up.
Yep.
But if I said to you, I'm not sure whether you're a homeowner, but if you got today, if we had next to you across the desk from me, 4 or 5 people of differing ages who never owned a home and want to own a home, and we said to them, well, you can have, we can give you $50,000 or $60,000, but it'll cost you $10,000 or $15,000 overall more over 40 years or 30 years. You know what they'll all say? They'll say, no worries.
Yeah, of course.
They'll say, we'll pay it.
Yep.
Any day of the week. Because, I was talking to an Uber driver just the other day in Darwin, and he was asking me about the grants, and he was saying, so, I've never been able to save, I just can't save. I've got, 30,000 or whatever I've got, 40,000. I think it was 30,000. He says, will I be able to go to the bank and say, with my letter, which says that I'm entitled to the grant, and show the bank of that? And I said, absolutely. You'll be able to go there and say, so instead of giving 40,000 or 30,000, you'll have 90,000 or 80,000.
Yep.
And that's a game changer for people. That gets them over the deposit gap, or at least makes a huge contribution to doing so.
Yep.
So it really will be significant. And so the key point about this is that it's not about affordability. It's just not. It's about bridging the deposit gap. It's about getting people into home ownership.
Right.
The other criticism of it is that it brings forward demand. So people will say, these people are going to buy a house anyway in 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
Well, they may well have been. We don't know that for sure because I defy anyone to have a crystal ball. But what we do know about these grants is that they do bring forward demand, and that's absolutely the point.
Yep.
These grants, there's no coincidence, as I was saying, that these grants to build new homes happen in times of economic downturn. And the territory economy needs this economic boost. It needs desperately private sector investment, and it needs to increase its population. It needs to increase economic growth for the construction industry as well as for the whole economy.
Yep.
And that's why these grants are great, because a crisis situation needs a crisis response.
Yep.
And no one's pretending that this is not bringing forward demand. What we're saying is that it actually is about bringing forward demand. Bring it forward now.
Yep.
Instead of waiting 5 years to build a house, we want people to build them now.
Yep.
So that the private sector comes in, the dollars throughout the economy. There's been heaps of work done by academic and government institutions which show that for every $1 spent in residential building, there's something like $3 that circles through the economy in terms of its economic multiplier.
Yep.
You can say that it's $2.50. You can say it's $4. You can say, but it's all around in that ballpark.
Yep.
And that's great for the economy, not just the construction industry, which obviously is my passion at the moment.
Yep.
But it's great for the economy.
But we had a candidate, Tanzil Rahman, and he said that he's CLP candidate for Fong Lim, and he said that he's a demographer by trade, and he said that the two strongest periods I think in territory history in terms of growth have correlated extremely strongly with increases in home building and buying, I think, at the same
Absolutely.
time. So he says the two are like inexorably linked.
Absolutely.
And if you can get that right, everything else will sort of take care of itself. Is that sort of how you
Absolutely.
You see it?
Yeah. That's true. That's true. But what he's not saying, not to say that he's wrong, he's completely right. But it's a as we know with economics, it's a sort of a circle, right? So the reason why that's the case is because there would have been strong economic activity as well.
Yep.
Right. So it boosts each other.
Sure.
So what happens is you have home building, strong periods of home building, that then fosters economic activity, increases confidence. You get outside and private investors who say, look at the territory and say, that's an opportunity. I'm going to put my money in there. Because you've got to remember, with private sector investment, this the biggest difference of all, and it sounds obvious, well, it is obvious, but the biggest difference of all is that it's their money or your money or my money. So it's not public servants saying, I'm going to push 12 million of taxpayers' money over to there.
Yeah.
It's people, private individuals and private companies who are putting their personal money into the territory. So when people like you set up a podcast and I'm in your really cool office at the moment, with you've obviously invested a lot of money of your own money in this fantastic equipment and everything else like that. What you're doing is you're putting your own personal money into this facility in Darwin, and taking that chance, if you like, on Darwin.
Yep.
And the territory.
Yeah.
And we need people to do that, but you're not going to do that if you don't have confidence. And one of the things that building activity in resi building in particular, but also, or not just particular, but resi building and civil construction and commercial construction is that it fosters confidence.
Yep.
So we often say that you need for a strong economy, you need a strong construction industry and vice versa.
Right.
They're inextricably linked. There's a symbiotic relationship.
Yep.
More than any other industry probably.
Should governments be considering other measures such as stamp duty, concessions, and things like that, or is that, I don't know, does that work in your mind? You probably have the data on those type of initiatives.
Look, I think stamp duty concessions always work.
Yep. But are we robbing Peter to pay Paul here? You know what I mean? Like we're giving government money for subsidies, as well as you might cost you $60,000 in stamp duty depending on the house you buy. You know what I mean? So like, are we sort of?
Well, I think governments are always going to make money.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, they're always going to make. Yeah, that's true. They'll get tax time now. We'll see how much. But they're always going to make money on new private sector investment in housing because people come. It creates such a big economic dividend, an economic multiplier effect that means that other businesses, suppliers and small businesses and whatever else in the economy benefit, which means they pay more tax. So governments always are going to make money out of surges in residential construction. And that's the other thing that people need to always recognise. That's why there's an economic boost. So governments will do that. Stamp duty is a tricky one in the sense that I'm a big advocate for stamp duty concessions, particularly for first home buyers. And
it's one of the few levers that territory government actually has at its disposal, right? We can't control capital gains, we can't control negative gearing, things like that.
No.
So sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right.
Just wanted to, as an aside,
Yeah, I think it's important, but you've also got to be careful as a territory government to be fair to them. If you're going to give people big housing incentives, then you also need to be able to get stamp duty back.
Right.
But what they can do, I think, is that, as you say, though, what's key about stamp duty is there's different ways you can skin that cat, right?
Yep.
It's one of the levers. So you can do things like you could let people choose between stamp duty and land tax or whatever. You could give people, let them pay it up gradually, right? You could say, okay, well, we're going to charge you, I don't know, $50,000 in stamp duty, but we'll let you pay that, $10,000 a year for the next however many years.
Yeah, yep.
So 5 years in that case, obviously, but less potentially or more. So given that, and then if you leave the house or sell the house, then you've got to pay it all off. So there's different ways of using that lever.
Yep.
And it's really important to do. But let's also, let's. I know that people have a bad rap for negative gearing and capital gains.
Well, I'd actually like to get your thoughts on it. Yeah,
Sure.
Obviously it's a federal thing, but how does I know you can't speak on Master Builder's behalf anymore, considering you're 1 foot out the door. But how has Master Builders internally viewed capital gains, the tax benefit? Is it the benefit? Yeah, the capital gains tax benefit, and then negative gearing. They're two policies that have been entrenched in Australian culture for, I think, negative gearing was in the 30s maybe. It was introduced, it's been around for a really long time and it was introduced to stimulate housing shortages, and it's been in its various machinations been changed through different governments. But how has the Master Builders viewed those policies, good or bad, over the journey?
So before I go into that, I think you touched on a really important point, that these measures have been around for a very long time, not so much capital gains tax, but negative gearing and other housing measures. What that really shows is how important private sector housing and home ownership are to our democracy and to our economy. So if you look at the history of countries like Australia and Canada and the UK and those places, what's been inextricably linked to more egalitarian societies and more opportunities and a flatter social structure, if you like, has been home ownership. It's the single thing that everyone can aspire to, and it's not easy.
The Aussie dream.
The Aussie dream, but also the Canadian dream and the New Zealand dream. It's what it is. It's people want to own their own home for a reason.
Yep.
Is that it's a step up into changing your fortune as a person or as a family. You can own your own home that'll go up or gradually go up, and everyone knows, if you look at even with superannuation, for instance, you compare the two, over the same period, basically over, say, your 40, 50, 60 years, home ownership or the price of value of a home goes up, relatively speaking, the same as shares do. So home ownership's and being keen, you own that, you have a security, you feel better about everything because you're not worried about the landlord or whatever else.
Hard asset.
It's right, exactly.
Yep.
And even if it goes down a bit, it'll go back up eventually, and
people always need a place to live.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
So home ownership's crucial. That's the reason why governments, Liberal and Labor, have made these sort of initiatives. And so go on to your other point. So Master Builders Australia, I can talk about this because I was there, has really one of its key policies is the maintenance of negative gearing and capital gains tax benefits. In the 2019 federal election, when Labor were proposing to basically abolish or reform, I think they were abolishing it, along with some other tax measures, Master Builders Australia fought really hard against that.
Right.
Did a whole lot of economic research to show that the benefits, and one of the really interesting things about that is how these sort of myths get around, that the baby boomers are so terrible because they own so much property, or people negatively gear, or all evil housing investors have all got 20 properties and are using taxpayer benefits to do that. That's ridiculous, quite frankly, and it's one of the most ridiculous things. I know I hate to break it to millennials or to Gen Y or anybody else who've got these perceptions, but it's bullshit. And the reason is negative gearing, you have to make a loss. Negative gearing, what it does is you make a loss you invest in a property, and after you've made all your repayments and your maintenance and whatever else, you make a loss. In other words, you pay more for that than you make. And what then happens is you get a tax refund, basically, for the differential.
Yep.
Essentially. And so if you were a evil housing investor, a billionaire, you're not going to go, I'm going to take a loss on all these investments that I'm making in order to get a tax refund. You're going to say, I'm going to buy this outright because I've got $12 billion in my bank. I'm going to go and buy 28,000 houses and then rent them all out and make a squillion.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to be I guess, careful of the fact that, that we don't have these myths. I'm all in favour of debate, but it's got to be evidence-based.
Right.
And so the Master Builders Australia, when Bill Shorten was opposition leader, was really, in that 2019 election, was really strongly opposed and campaigned really hard on that. The other part of negative gearing is that where the hard data is that, part of the hard data is that, there's lots of people across the spectrum who are using negative gearing. So one of the great moments in the 2019 election campaign was when a CMFU official who isn't Master Builders' natural ally in the world asked Bill Shorten what's all this crap about negative gearing, because he was a negative gearer. Because for people who are in middle to low incomes, it's one of the few things you can do to sometimes get into the housing market. You can negative gear a house for a couple of years, then move into it or not. But it's one of those things you can do also to boost your family wealth, to then provide opportunities for your kids to move your family up in the world. So it's and the data shows that most people who negatively gear are in the sort of the 1 to 2% property. No, the 1 to 2 property bracket. So there's other perceptions floating around that people who negatively got 12 and 11 properties. That's the vast majority have got 1 or 2.
Yep.
And there's lots of people, nurses and doctors and police people and all those, everyone. Who in every segment who benefits from it. So the answer is that, and it fosters home ownership. And home ownership again is so important, not just to the economy, but to our polity, if you like, to who we are to our democracy. It started off. Don't forget in the sort of 125 years ago, or whatever. In that time, when you didn't used to be able to vote unless you owned property. So we have a situation that's not the case now. But home ownership is really embedded in our culture, and for a really good reason. It's a way forward to security and well-being and all those sorts of things. So yeah.
But have we maybe overstepped the mark in terms of the importance of housing in the Australian economy? In terms of getting a 30-year mortgage, loading up as much as you can, sort of being trapped in a sense, instead of say having housing just as a but maybe being able to write off the tax on your principal place of residence, something like that, instead of investment properties. And then maybe people will be more intent on investing that money in businesses. I think in the OECD or whatever it is, we're something like the 70th in the world of economic complexity. We're houses and holes. We're miners and we build houses and then we speculate on those houses, and that's how we build wealth, instead of actually maybe innovating and investing in businesses that might actually give us a more diverse economy and maybe give us more strings to our bow. Do you think that we've maybe overstepped that balance in terms of what the focus of our economy should be? Doesn't sound like it.
That's a really good question and a very multifaceted one.
Because I agree. Just for the record, I own a couple of properties. So I think it's great. I really think having a stable home and home ownership is a critical part of any stable society. But I think in terms of how far, or the emphasis that we do place on home ownership and that being sort of the only way to wealth for most people in Australia, I think maybe that balance is just tipped in that favour a little bit. And I think maybe we could sort of review.
Reset?
Just how we approach it.
Oh, I think it's a really good point. I think we should always be trying to rejig and reset and looking at how it works. So I think the point you raise about tax deductions for your family home are an interesting one.
I think they do it in America.
Yeah, and I think also in America they're good too. You get instant tax deductions for things like if you invest in your plant and your equipment. So for instance, you're no doubt writing off slowly all this great equipment that I've already mentioned several times, but it's really impressive. But in America, you'd be able to write off straight away.
Yep.
Although in Australia we do have the $20,000 tax write-off, which is good for small business. But you could, in the US you could write it off straight away. You could probably buy a building and write it off straight away as well. And that's those sort of tax things are tax key. I mean, if you look at negative gearing, one of the things it shows is that it's treatment of tax that is so important in stimulating economic activity and innovation.
Yep.
So that's really important. I don't think that home ownership is overstated or should be considered overstated. I don't think that's right. I think home ownership remains and should remain absolute pillar.
Yep.
Because I think it's so important, not just for the economy, but also for people's well-being. And I think that there's lots of businesses who start off using the value or the equity in their home as a key starter. And I think that shows, the importance of it, because there's lots of people, you and I and lots of other people don't have. We're not sitting in, in Martin Place in Sydney getting briefed on the latest share price, the latest share issue in some new whiz-bang AI,
IPO.
application. IPO, that's right. We're not getting that.
Yeah.
So the average person, how do they do it? Well, they do it through home ownership, and that's historically true, and it's historically true now.
Yep.
And that's why it's really important to keep home ownership in reach of people. But I do agree that I think we should always be looking at to see how we do that. And I think that there's, ideas around as you were saying about the tax treatment of your own home or the one you live in. And we do need to diversify. We absolutely do. Having said that, people should not forget, I think we Australians all forget, but including everybody, myself, but everyone forgets that the reason we're not in recession pretty much now, or the reason we haven't been in recession, given the state of the really low economic growth levels we've had pre-COVID and post, is because of the resources.
Yeah.
If we didn't have everyone buying dirt out of Australia, and we would be in a way worse position. It's why, despite everything, the federal government had surplus last year, and was able to blow it all, on their promises. So it's if we didn't have that, we'd be in real trouble. But having said that, we all look. How many? I'm totally agreeing with you, but I just ask you, how many times in the last 30 years have there been debates in Australian politics about the need for innovation and diversification of the economy? It's constant. How much of it's happened? Not much. But that's because it's pretty hard to feel urgent about it when you're sitting on all this money.
Oh, 100%. I agree.
But having said that, sitting in here again, I'm going to mention the fabulous office yet again. You're inspired. I mean, I agree. You need to, these sort of enterprises that you're doing, need to be supported and through tax treatments and through all sorts of things, and government grants or whatever else to foster.
Yep.
In terms of livability in Darwin, these sort of enterprises like yours are really important because it adds to the culture and the vibrancy and that's needed to make livable communities.
Yep. Just maybe sticking with federal government policy for just a second longer, the wealth effect. Do you know about the wealth effect? Have you heard about it?
No.
I'm going to butcher it, but I'll try and explain what it is.
Go.
And I think federal governments over the years might be a little bit addicted to the wealth effect. So there's a study that I think when people buy, say, a hard asset, and it goes up in price, say it goes from, you buy a house, it goes from 500 to 800,000. And until you've actually sold the house, it's just numbers on a page. But because they feel wealthier, they spend more money in the economy. So it means, less money in savings and, I guess more money sort of circulating through the economy. And I think that's what politicians these days, with modern monetary theory and all those sorts of things, seem to like. Do you think that maybe our federal governments are a little bit addicted to that type of thing, so they want to just keep juicing the housing market just to keep that sort of economic activity in motion?
Well, I think to properly inform that discussion, I think what I'd say is that one of the things when we talk about inflation, it's a bit academic, but what we're talking about really is buying power.
Right.
It's probably a better way of putting it, is buying power. So it's people's ability to go overseas and or to buy, in my case, a new driver for my golf game.
Very important.
Very important. And, and buy that and not feeling like I have to, scrimp and save, or not feeling like it's a, massively, totally overindulgent, exercise because I can still afford to do other things, right? So it's that buying power. It's my ability to go with my weekly pay packet and get the things that I want to do. And what happens with inflation when it goes up, which it is at the moment, when people talk about cost of living, what they really mean is buying power.
Right.
And so what we had for a long time pre-COVID was low inflation and high buying power. People were able to go overseas, afford their overseas holidays, they were able to go and buy, go and buy whatever they wanted to buy, new cars and, holiday homes and
better standard of living.
jet skis and God knows what else, right? And so when you say, yes, that's what the economists call it, better standard of living. But what I'm saying is there's buying power, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens is when people start to get shitty with their politicians is when they feel like they can't do that, right? When they think I can't go away with the kids, or I can't go to the next model of four-wheel drive or whatever because I can't afford it, right? And it would start to impinge on my ability, my spending power, my buying power. So yeah, I do agree with you that that's what really exercise politicians for a really good reason.
Yep.
And that's the reason why is because when you go to vote for someone, the thing that's really in your head is how you're feeling about your buying power, right?
Yep.
It's like I can't afford to buy that bloody jet ski. This is just out of control. I'm going to vote for the other bloke or the other person. And so that's of course that's the reason. I agree with you. What you're really raising here in lots of ways is really important public policy issues that just don't get thought about.
Yep.
And because, people don't think about them because they think they're focused on their wealth and their buying power, and politicians don't think about it because all they really care about is getting re-elected in lots of ways.
Yeah.
They would say they're really concerned about all public and social issues. Of course they are. I'm not denying that. But they're ultimately concerned about getting re-elected. And so the hip pocket, as I always say, hip pocket nerve is one of the most sensitive, or the most sensitive, one of the most sensitive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And we've talked about the CLP and the Labor subsidies that they've offered. That's all well and good, but do you see the banks as being an impediment as well? So, if the subsidies that everyone's got are, I've got 50, 60 grand from the government that I want to kick into this build, and a bank looks at your earnings, or they're looking at flat capital growth in a place like Darwin, are they an impediment to growth here? They're not going to lend money to your average Joe. Do you see that being a problem?
So before I talk about that, I'd say, and I have to say again at this point that I'm not talking on behalf of Master Builders, because I'm absolutely not when I say this. This is not about Master Builders. I'm leaving to go down south. I've resigned and I'm heading off. So let's be clear about that. But it's, as I said before, it's really positive for the Territory that we both major parties committed to those grants.
Yep.
But the CLP policy is broader than just first home owners. And it's, first of all, it's homeowners from anywhere, which is really important again because Darwin has to be and the Territory has to be competitive against other jurisdictions. One of the things we have to do is I talk to people in my previous role. They would say that they had, a migrant worker who came to Darwin for a job opportunity with them, but in Perth, someone would offer them 30 grand to move over there, and then they went over there. There was housing grants that were really attractive, and they had fast track to permanent residency, and that makes Perth really, really more competitive than Darwin. And one of the things that we have to be in Darwin is the best place, the easiest place to do business, and the best place to come, the place with the most opportunities.
Yep.
If we're going to compete with places like major cities like Brisbane and Perth, we need to be the best place, the easiest place.
Yep.
And so the CLP grants are broader, so they don't just apply to Territorians, although they obviously are focused, the first homeowner ones, on Territorians.
Yep.
But they're also for other people to come, and then also they're broader because they're for owner occupiers. So there's $30,000 available in the CLP grant structure for people who have previously owned their own home, or even currently own a home down south, to come here. And the reason why that's so powerful is because we want people to build as many homes as we can in Territory. We want to maximise the economic benefit. The economic impact of those policies is if they're broader. They're also uncapped in terms of the house price or the home build. So that, again, broadens it out. It means that people previously, lots of times, incomes are capped, eligibility incomes are capped in, I would argue, too low.
Yep.
Because governments always want to be seen as being only helping lower to middle income earners.
Okay.
But historically, if you earn $90,000 as an individual and $120,000 as a household, that's not really what I would argue is a middle income these days. And so, as I said to you, these are economic measures too. These are about stimulating economic activity and economic growth, so for the benefit of everybody. And so, therefore, we need them to be effective. And if you make them as broad as possible, not indefinitely, but for a substantial period, then you will that will have a much bigger economic benefit.
Yep.
And so that's important. And in terms of the banks, absolutely. But that's about confidence too. So,
that's sort of why I mentioned the stagnant, capital growth and things like that. The banks do look at.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're a bank and you say, if you're a bank and I can't unfortunately tell this story, but I can, I guess, hint at it, that I know that there are already some institutions that are looking at the territory now and saying, given that both parties are committed to these grants, and that will obviously, it's been proven time after time after time in Australia that it will stimulate building activity, residential building activity.
Yep.
And they're looking at it and going, well, therefore we're feeling more confident about the territory housing market and the territory economy. And the banks will react to that. Obviously, whoever wins or whoever forms government after the early 24 election will have to work with the banks to make sure that they will recognise the grants. But that happened in the Federal Home Builder Scheme. The banks do. It's not so much that they accept it as part of the deposit, I guess, but they factor it in. So they say you might have 40 grand now. We're not going to make the 50 grand or 60 grand part of your deposit, but we're going to factor it in because we know that you're going to get it because you've got this piece of paper from the government. So it's going to be a benefit. So the banks absolutely have to part of the equation. So in terms of, for instance, bank lending for owner occupiers and for construction of new homes, new residential properties in Darwin, it's been terrible. I mean, over the last 12 months, I think the last time I saw the figures was again in the March quarter was something like down 37%, and that's really terrible, right? But it's about confidence. Financial institutions, people like those sort of people who we need to be confident in the economy to lend people, so they'll lend you money to invest in the territory. You aren't going to do it unless they're confident in the economy, which is why a strong economy is really important, which is why economic policy in terms of the lead up to this election is really important. There's a strong economy, which I'd argue needs a strong building industry and will lead to a strong building industry. And so that's really important. But yes, so it's about confidence for private sector investment.
Just circling back to defence now, Master Builders released a report regarding defence recently. Can you tell us a little bit about that report and maybe why the defence industry is so significant to the territory?
Sure. So again, this goes right back before my time in Master Builders Northern Territory. So it goes back to 2015, 16, 17, where sort of the Department of Defence and what's called the US Force Posture Agreement, which is about the US military wanting to conduct more activities in Australia, Northern Australia, and underpins things like the MRF-D, which is the Marine Force Rotation that happens annually. They asked people like Master Builders whether we had the capacity and capability to to deliver, to construct and do civil works and et cetera, for defence projects in Northern Australia and in the Territory. And Master Builders said, obviously, yes, as though we would, or they would, because I'm not the job anymore. But what they did was commission economic research, economic independent research, to model that and show that there was capacity, what was called capacity to spare in the Territory. And this is a really important thing because it continues to be a massive issue today. And so those reports formed a really important part, the evidence base, to lobby the then federal government to change the procurement rules, which means that instead of having massive tier one construction businesses with huge work packages, which no small business can participate in, it was changed so that basically local businesses and local small businesses across the building supply chain have a realistic opportunity for tender to work.
Sure.
Which has been a huge success. And what data from ICNNT shows is that that's over the period between now and then that the local participation of local construction companies has gone up, and local construction people in the supply chain, so small businesses as well, has gone up from 30 to 70%, roughly, or maybe it's around that. So it's a significant, it's a really big thing, and so that's really important, and that continues to be the case. Obviously, we still have capacity to spare, but what the latest report is called a $1 billion partnership, which is talking about the defence investment that's coming from the Australian Defence Force and the US DoD, the Department of Defence, which is $6.2 billion. I think it's about $4 billion from Australia or whatever, and the rest from the US. And that, as I said before, we think that's conservative, or most people think that's conservative. And what that means is that there's a really big opportunity for the Territory to really consolidate its economy and its community from that defence investment. Because it probably will be bigger if we play our cards right, but also because at the moment there's that massive investment. So the report found, for instance, at the time, given things have moved slightly to the right, that's probably not going to be as impactful, but it's got the potential to increase the economic growth of the gross state product in the Territory by nearly between 4 and 5% at the time. That's probably slightly gone slightly gone down a fraction because it'll be spread out over a larger period, a longer period, slightly longer period. I think. But it's a huge investment. And if you put aside government investment Territory government investment, it's probably the thing that's keeping the Territory economy going at the moment. $1 billion a year flowing into the Territory economy from defence. And without that, there wouldn't be much going on.
We'd be nowhere.
And so one of the things that Master Builders has been saying is that to really you need an economic base to capitalise on and maximise the economic benefit. What this is defence opportunities is to say we can really use this to grow our population. We can bring people from overseas and from wherever to come here and deliver, to work in those projects. If you can get them into home ownership, which is where the grants come in, get them into home ownership, that means that they'll stay. And you need people to sustain these projects. So once you build the facilities and whatever else, you need people to work on them and maintain them. And when defence brings other things like hopefully, littoral ships and other things, and potentially in the future, whatever, submarines or whatever else, and obviously, fighter jets, whatever else, you want them to be based here. So you need people to work on those. And that's an opportunity for people to come and to take opportunities, and that means that you need then to build more hospitals and build more things to do. So, more mountain bike circuits and art galleries and cafes and all those sorts of things to do. And that's the sort of thing that can happen. But we need the policies to sustain that. So that's one of the reasons why private sector housing is so important, for instance, because no one who's going to come to work on a defence project to build it or sustain it and their family's going to live in social housing. They're not going to do that. Social housing is for people there's a cohort of the community that needs social housing. And I'm fully passionate about those people needing to be looked after. My brother, for instance, has a really severe mental illness, and if he didn't have my parents, who are fortunately for him quite well off, if he didn't have them, then he'd be one of those people who would really need social housing. But he's fortunate he doesn't. But there's a cohort of those people who need that support. But the rest of the economy, for the rest of the people, it's got to be about home ownership. It increases supply of rental housing as well. And for rentals, and that's why home ownership is really, really important in increasing the supply of private housing. Because if you're going to bring American defence personnel or from India or from Japan, for instance, you don't want them living on base. You want them living in the community and being part of the economy, and so you want to. And that's why it's important to have those houses that are available. They're not going to live in social housing. And neither are the workers who come here to build those facilities and work on them. So we need those things in other words, to allow us to take advantage of the $1 billion, a year that's coming in, and probably more, that's coming in to the Territory economy. Otherwise, we'll end up with the same old problem, which is FIFO. And everyone in Darwin, I've only been here 2 years, but every time I'm somewhere, everyone mentions FIFO and how terrible it is. But if you don't want that, you've got to build lots of housing, and you've got to make the place livable. You've got to address the issues of livability, but lots of housing. So the thing about defence is it's really important. Now, the other thing about defence is the issue of capability and capacity, which remains a really big issue. So there are people in Canberra and the Department of Defence and elsewhere who say that Darwin's the worst place on earth.
That was going to be my next question, because I think do we have like a 2.7% unemployed? Like, we got a really tight labour market, I think, up here, and do we have the the skills, like you say, the capability and capacity to, fulfill these projects.
So one of the things that the Master Builders $1 billion partnership report shows, as did the capacity to spare ones previous to that, show that the territory construction sector,
Yep.
in particular, but I guess the economy as well, has a history of being able to scale up over, for instance, the last decade to deal with surges in demand.
Yep.
So with resources projects, the Impact's just one, and there's other ones as well. They've resulted in the sector, the construction industry, and other bits of the economy in scaling up to take on more workers, to bring in more labour, to have those skills. And at the moment, again, ICNNT data will show you that there is local trade capacity that's is still available,
right?
And to be activated in and accessed in Darwin, in the territory. But what we need is for people like the Department of Defence to be giving much more transparency to what they're going to be doing, building, and when. So again, if you're a small business, or particularly small businesses, but even any business, you want to know. If you're going to spend money, you want to know that you've got a pipeline of work, or you've got where the next job is and where everything's coming from. And so, what the report says is that calls on the Australian Defence Department to actually be more transparent about what's coming and where and what. Obviously, recognising the security issues, but more transparent and providing a more programmatic report view. So this is the types of facilities and the types of build activity that's going to be coming in the next 5 years or next 2 years. Because, for instance, if you look at security and estate work, which is sort of like the smaller works around maintenance and things, that's one of the real incubators of locally incubators of small businesses in the construction sector. Mm-hmm. But you need a continuum of work and some transparency around that. In terms of what's coming, to invest.
Yeah.
So
new piece of equipment, or
also capacity. So one of the things it's definitely you need more people. You probably need more admin people to work for the defence because it's of the natural defence complexities that you have to deal with. Getting people on base and security clearances and God knows what else. So you need more support. But if you're going to invest in that for your business, then you need to know that there's a pipeline. And so we know there is a pipeline, but it tends to be pretty sort of lots of plateaus and not a lot of warning when there is one.
Is it boom bust? Is that an inadequate?
Not boom bust,
because
but it can feel a bit like it.
Well, that's how people in the territory view it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that investment pipeline. Excuse me. And small businesses trying to gear up for the next major project, not having that transparency about whether they're going to invest in the next piece of plant or equipment. How do we combat? Maybe if it's not a boom bust, how do we sort of combat that perception, and then how do we actually, remedy that cycle, that boom bust cycle? Is it because it seems like a lot of governments are trying to hang their hat on finding the next sort of massive major project, the next sea farms or the sun cable or the impacts or something like that. That's kind of impacts left a little bit of scorched earth in its wake, like with small businesses losing staff and, housing prices increasing and that sort of thing. How do we sort of combat that from a construction viewpoint? Well,
so there's a macro and a micro element to that. So at a macro level, it comes back to the strength of the economy, and I've said it a few times, but it's really the truth. So you need a really strong economy, or you need a stronger economy. You need government that is really focused on being pro-business and pro-private investment, because what that does is it increases capacity and smooths things out. The other element too is you need governments to be able to go after the big unicorn projects, if you like, because of course you want them. You want to get the impacts from WA. You want to get those. You need them. They are amazing, but you need to also be going after the smaller and fostering economic growth and private sector innovation and activity at a smaller scale. And so what I think can be the problem is that you end up with governments putting emphasis on one or the other.
Right.
And so one of the things that needs to happen from the next territory government, whoever that is that there's a bit more balance.
Right.
We'd hate to see someone say, decrease emphasis on investment in chasing defence and lobbying defence and cementing relationships with our allies in the US and other places. That would be terrible. People should be investing more in defence NT and that capacity. But they should also be going out and should definitely be going after the next big resources projects or those things. But they also need to be doing the
grassrootsy
the grassrootsy sort of stuff. You know, fostering podcast people and
the family business,
you know, and getting someone to open a cafe and those sorts of things. And they need those policies because what that does is it means that not everyone's sweating all the time on, you know, at the moment in the territory, it's like, when is the next big project coming? Because, as you rightly say, there's not a lot else going on, right? In terms of that. I mean, obviously defence is underpinning a lot of things, but, you know, if you had defence here, if you had the territory government's infrastructure investment, if you had big resources projects, and you had, crucially, you know, as you say, more fostering of private sector activity, that would really reduce the emphasis on this boom and bust element, because you're not investing everything in trying to find the new major project which lasts for a certain period. You've got constant activity, and that's why also it's really important to have policies that foster a much stronger economy and a big population, capitalising on defence and massively increasing massively increasing private sector housing, because what that does is it fosters a stronger economy and means that there's a bigger population. It means that there are people here to growing the economy, and it means that there is a bigger private sector economy that's not reliant just on those big projects.
Yep.
Which is what you want.
Yep. Well,
the micro part is
okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was
please,
going to say that
please.
The micro part is the micro part is about, and you know, now I'm no longer in Master Builders, I can talk about the economy as a whole without trespassing on anyone else's territory. But the micro part is about saying, addressing issues like livability, and also how you build, how you build the innovation and attract private sector demand. So if we think about where we are now, not just in your office, but if we duck outside into the
Air Raid Arcade.
Air Raid Arcade, you've got really groovy cafes. Groovy is not the right word, I know, whatever you call it when you're a young person. But
I wouldn't know.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
not
what I know. But you've got great little cafes next door, down the front, and you've got little businesses all the way up, and that's the sort of thing that you want, right? And that, but fostering that. So if you look at places like Melbourne and Sydney, a lot of those livability and amenities that people love came from sort of government policies, liquor laws, and I know I've got issues with that in the territory, but but policies policies that support businesses like yours and cafes and little organic precincts to develop. And the territory government will say they do that, and I'm sure they do, but they could do a lot more. And we need, that's what has to happen. It goes back to the previous point, which is that the next territory government really needs to be focused on not just one or the other, but a more comprehensive approach to private sector investment and capitalising on public sector investment.
Yep. Well, that was fantastic insight into the construction side of things, Ben. Thank you. I never had that sort of insight from an industry insider. We usually like to give our guests a little bit of an opportunity to spruik anything that they've got going on. If you don't have anything, what's potentially Master Builders as a parting gift to them? What have they got on the boil going forward?
Well, I think for Master Builders, they should receive some credit for the fact that they've lobbied really effectively for these housing grants. From this, now that there's both sides of politics that are committed to them.
Yep.
Master Builders NT is really a powerhouse in terms of its advocacy around for defence. I mean, if there'd be thousands of businesses in the territory right now who wouldn't be anywhere near in the position that they're in, working on defence projects, if it hadn't been for Master Builders advocacy, which occurred way before I got here. Those reforms that meant that there are work packages which small businesses locally can tender for are a really good thing. I've had meetings before my departure now with really big tier one businesses that are looking to come up here to base themselves or have a presence because of the work to defence. Well, because of the forecast pipeline up here in Darwin and the territory. I'd say that I would just be urging both the opposition leader and also the CLP leader and Territory Labor leader to be really committed to investing in and as I said, the territory government, territory Labor, because we're in the election cycle basically now. They deserve credit for investing in going into America and for and Defence NT, but both parties need to. I'd be really disappointed if you saw that post election there was some decrease in the commitment to fostering defence investment, and that's really, really important. That happens, and master builders and other groups need to be down in Canberra all the time. Like it or not, the federal budget's really the territory budget, and things that happen up here, decisions are made in Canberra. We can all grumble and groan about that, but that's the truth. And so you need to be in Canberra. You need to be advocating for the territory down there. It's all about relationships. It's all about being down there. You can't just go there and never go back for 3 years. You need to be there, all the time.
Yeah.
Particularly for territory. And that's, again, you can grumble and groan, but with our economy, we need to have those links to Canberra, and we should be outward facing, looking towards America and in defence context, and to Japan and other places, again, not just for defence but for other parts of the economy as well. Though I just think that there's so much potential in the territory, but Territorians have to be a little bit, I think, to be controversial, and people will probably turn off at this point. But Territorians, I think, can be really, I would say complacent's the wrong word, although I think it does happen, that people think things will happen. They'll think, oh, look, defence will come. Mm-hmm. Eventually, and other impacts will come. It'll just happen. I don't have to do it. I can just go fishing. No, you can't, because you've got to remember that Townsville, Cairns, Western Australia, other places further down south are really saying, no, don't go there. Don't go to the territory. It's a hellhole, or it's, I was there in 1962 and it was shit, and there's nothing to do except to, go out in your boat. And that's that. You need to be addressing those issues and also countering the myths that are untrue.
Yeah.
Because even if they're not true, and a lot of them aren't, that's still a belief that happens, right? And we all know from marketing and from the things you buy every day. When you go to the supermarket, often you don't buy them because of what objectively they are, or their objective benefits are. It's your perception.
Yep.
Or it's you being aware of what the actual factual benefits are, which you didn't know before. So, everyone buys vitamins or whatever, fresh vegetables, because they know the benefits. Why do they know the benefits? Because someone tells them. So we need to be out there doing that for the territory, and not just in a tourism sense, but in a business sense.
Right.
So, look, I could talk forever, but that's...
Well, I think that's a good note to leave it on. So,
thank you.
Ben Carter, thanks for your time, mate, and best of luck with the next chapter.
No worries. Thank you, mate.
Thanks, everyone.